Hello and welcome to a special bonus video from Under the Mountain. My name is Anthony and I lead Under the Mountain here at the O'Neill Library. And if you are watching this video, you might have recognized some of the clips from it used in our advertising leading up to our September 17th event with Jeff VanderMeer. This is from the future, so this is from the future, but also from the past, which is fitting for some of Jeff VanderMeer's work. So I would like to first just introduce Jeff VanderMeer, and then we are going to get started talking about a few things from his books and some of his writing, and we'll hopefully get to have a little bit more content that we can only have so much of in live events. But thank you, Jeff, for joining me today. And I would like to just give a little bit for people who maybe don't know anything about you, just a little bit of background information. Jeff VanderMeer hails originally from Pennsylvania, but spent much of his formative years in the Fuji Islands, where his parents worked for the Peace Corps. He later relocated to Gainesville, Florida, and then attended college at Florida State University. In the late 80s, while still a high school student, VanderMeer began writing for small press magazines and self-publishing his own stories. Considered an exciting new voice in weird fiction, VanderMeer achieved widespread acclaim with his Southern Reach trilogy, the first of which, Annihilation, won the Nebula and Shirley Jackson Awards for Best Novel, and in 2018 was adapted into a major motion picture directed by Alex Garland, starring Natalie Portman and Jennifer Jason Leigh. VanderMeer resides in Tallahassee and, alongside his own fiction, is a frequent editor of science fiction and horror anthologies, as well as a contributor to the likes of the New York Times, The Guardian, Vulture, Esquire.com, and the Los Angeles Times. VanderMeer's most recent releases are the eco-thriller Hummingbird Salamander and his first YA novel, A Peculiar Peril. His most recent cycle of fiction, Born, The Strange Bird, and Dead Astronauts, demonstrates what the author does best, creating mysterious and perilous worlds where nature and technology run amok, and then populating these unstable ecosystems with compassionately realized characters who, regardless of how vibrantly alien or monstrous as they may seem, all yearn to understand what it means to be that elusive quality we call human. So again, thanks for coming, Jeff, today. I guess just to get things going, since this sort of touches on some of the things I'd like to talk about, why don't we go ahead and just, as curious as you are a longtime resident of Florida, how does its environment inform the landscapes of your fiction?
Well, I mean, there's a constant rate of decay down here that you can't ignore. There's a semi-tropical kind of climate. There's a lot of rain. Life is extremely all around, in the wilderness is extremely rich and deep, and so you really are kind of, your senses are kind of inundated, and I like that. I like that a lot. I feel like I'm living in a place that's ultra alive, and where some of the processes that we might not normally see, including about decay, are kind of on the surface. And so I think that's definitely come into the fiction from a very early age, since I've lived here since I was about 10. And, I just feel at home here. Before that, my parents traveled quite a bit. And so it's also the first place I've really thought of as home. And, the more I learn about it, the fact that it's so biodiverse, even by worldwide standards, and so it has so many contradictions and so many different Floridas embedded in the one Florida. It's quite the place to live, even if it's sometimes complicated, messy, and there are issues.
Yeah, there's, I believe the Annihilation itself took place in Florida. Isn't that where the zone is? Yes. Is Born supposed to be in a version of Florida, or is it
No,
hard to say?
I don't know that it's really set in Florida. I thought more that the woman Rachel, who comes to this unknown city as a kind of refugee, is kind of roughly from the South Pacific originally, which I knew at least a little bit as a kid, so I could evoke some of that atmosphere for her past. But no, it's like, there are little elements in Born where you get the sense that a long time ago, The city was by the sea, and now it's in the middle of a desert. So there's little hints that maybe in the distant past it was something a little more like Florida.
Mhm. Well, speaking of Born in that landscape, because I feel like, not to say it old cliche, but setting is almost a character itself in your work. And I feel like Born in particular, it's very rich in its setting. And looking at that in terms of genre, which I feel like you as an author sort of defy being in any one genre at all. You write what you want to write clearly, and that's to our benefit. Does When you were writing Born, did it start off with this idea of the sort of almost bio magic, really, in a way, is how it presents it, or was it an image? Was it a scenario?
Yeah, usually I start with a very charged image that's attached to character and gives me some sense of what the character's journey is. And in this case, I saw this kind of sea anemone-like looking creature in what I thought was seaweed, and this woman reaching out to touch it or to take it, and then pulling back and realizing it's actually the matted fur of a giant bear that it's in the middle of, and then we're actually in a desert setting. And so that's when I knew that I was dealing with biotech on many different levels. And so in some ways, the whole city is anonymous, whereas the biotech is kind of the setting. And so it's very different from the Southern Reach, where there's a lot of description of the setting. Here, there's more description of the kind of creatures and whatnot that inhabit the city. And so you always have to kind of pick your level and pick what you decide to describe and what you don't, because you can't describe everything. And so it made sense to me that these kind of new beings, these kinds of biotech created by the company and the cast-offs, would be kind of in the forefront, and like the bones of the city would be in the backdrop, because the city is the past and these creatures are kind of the future in Born. So
When you set out to write one of a book, I guess, that expands into multiple books, do you set out with, is it just the story is told as it is told, or do you outline, do you plot, do you build systems of logic for your world?
well, I mean, it really kind of depends on the book and the context. For the Southern Reach, I kind of had a general idea of an overall story arc. I just wasn't sure how many novels it would take to complete that story. At one point, I thought it might be 4, not 3. And for Born, it's more that I left things unexplored in the text because the main character couldn't possibly know what they were, including what she in Born, the creature she finds, called dead astronauts, which may not be dead astronauts at all. And so it was a very powerful image, for me at least, the kind of resonant image that you didn't need to know what it meant for Born, except this idea perhaps of humans having gone to the stars and come back and kind of had failed and had come back to Earth. And then there was also this strange bird biotech that was mentioned in passing. And both of those images stuck with me, and I just eventually realized what they were and had to write about them. So it was a very organic process for Born. It wasn't really that I expected to write 2 more books. I didn't expect to write Dead Astronauts and Strange Bird, but at a certain point, I kind of was compelled to. And so that's the value of a good symbol or something that resonates even with the writer, to the point where there's a reason for it to then become part of kind of a conscious narrative. Most things like that come to me very organically. I do a lot of structuring and thinking about how the scenes are going to play out, what the general flow of the story is. Sometimes I will put in scaffolding and structure that's more strict, depending on the kind of novel it is. And others, it's kind of more like improv. So I generally tend to let the novel tell me how it wants to be written and what its structure is. And it can vary quite a bit.
Well, I do want to say that I think Dead Astronauts is a pretty inspired title for a work. I mean, it really captures the attention.
Yeah.
And also just a really uh, brassy novel, I guess is the polite way of saying it. I mean, in terms of that, I was not expecting it to be this like impressionistic mosaic novel, which is, not normally what you would expect in a follow-up. But I think that it's really interesting choice to do that. And one of the reasons why I asked about if you had it planned or if this just sort of organically came out of that was because it does feel, like as much as I enjoy Dead Astronauts, it's a book I feel like you have to have read Born to really appreciate, which is, I think, a really interesting choice.
Well, it's there's two things or three things about Dead Astronauts. One, I would say that there's a certain proportion of people who read it first and they don't have to have read Born, but it absolutely, especially if you don't read a lot of formally experimental fiction, I think it would be really, having that kind of in your face, and also not having the anchors of Born might be an issue. So it's been interesting to see people encounter Dead Astronauts first and then go on to Born, or Born and then to Dead Astronauts, or sometimes even Strange Bird and then go on to the other two. I kind of had to write it that way because I was trying to think about two things. What is failure that's actually success look like in terms of activism, and then two, dealing with having non-human perspectives and thinking that would mean that the narrative itself would be very different from a normal novel. And I started out as a experimental writer, and I started out as a poet, and so those things still kind of come naturally to me, and I kind of deployed them for Dead Astronauts. The other thing about it is I was just coming off the whole Annihilation movie experience, which was, actually fairly commercial behind the scenes, and made me kind of wary of going on to another project right away that was maybe also commercial, just in terms of how it might affect my imagination, my subconscious. So I kind of deliberately, in one sense, chose the most non-commercial thing that I could write after that, as a way of kind of like recharging. And then I never expected it would necessarily be published. I sent it to my editor. I said, this isn't under contract. If you decide that you don't want to publish it, I totally understand, because it's out of the blue. And in fact, he wrote back and said that he loved it. That he'd find a way to publish it, and they published it beautifully, and it actually sold pretty well, which is kind of amazing for basically a book that's prose poetry and long repetitions of the same words or sentences at times. So it's also a book that's meant to be read aloud. Parts of it, I think.
I was just joking with a colleague before this that if you were to do a public reading, you should do the chapter that's They Killed Me, They Brought Me Back Again. It's all 6 pages of it.
And I have done an abbreviated version of that with a different emphasis on different words, and then segued into the part where the fox is talking about all the different ways that people have killed foxes over the years. And that can be very powerful. I wouldn't ever read the full 6 pages, though. I think that would be, I think there'd be diminishing returns after a certain point in terms of on the read aloud.
Well, the foxes, that chapter actually was my favorite part of the book. Like, I felt that was really visceral, and I keep struggling with the word humanizing, because it feels like it doesn't feel apt, and I feel like anthropomorphizing, while although accurate, still doesn't feel quite like it too, which is, I think, one of the things that's really remarkable about Born, that I feel like the Born cycle rather. And one of the things I think is so interesting about Dead Astronauts is that it really feels like once you've read The Strange Bird, that sort of whets your appetite for this peeling back the layer of the world. And then you realize it's really all the life, the ecosystem, that's like the real heart of Born. And I think that's a really interesting decision to have them be that way. So I guess what I would just be curious to hear about is what, like, in searching for this through this work, we have obviously Rachel and Moss are heroes of the first novel, And then we have Bourne, who is, I guess, maybe an anti-hero of sorts, sort of your Heathcliff, if you will. And then we have the villains, which are Mord and the Magician, who is probably I think the only completely irredeemable character in the cycle. So she's just pretty awful from the get-go. But I guess, all these characters in some way are human in some form or another, or at least embody it. Also, I think of the Dark Bird in Dead Astronauts, which is, a really sad figure. And then so I guess just, what do you think it means, this quality to be human, that so many of the characters struggle with, or don't even think about in terms of their actions towards others or towards the environment?
Well, I mean, I think there's also the issue of like who we allow to be people, or in other words, it doesn't just depend on the entity that's being kind of evaluated. It depends on our perception of what being a person is. And I think that does get to the heart of how I want to talk about the human and the non-human, because we kind of, as a default, because of the kind of foundational way, especially in which kind of the monoculture or settler culture has thought about ecosystems, thought about animals, we by default relegate them to some lesser position that doesn't allow us to even kind of contemplate what they actually are. It's not even a matter of saying, well, trying to evaluate. We're very happy. We're very interested in hierarchies at which humans are at the top, and so we're kind of invested in that too. So that even when we kind of try to explore what some of our non-human brethren are like on this planet, it's still within that light of like, are they as intelligent as humans? Are they almost as intelligent as humans? Instead of asking questions like, how are they different and better than humans in some ways? Even just being able to appreciate the fact that there are animals who live completely different lives from us in how they sense the world, which is part of what I try to get across in my fiction. I think it's maybe a radical act, but it's also an act of empathy. And I think it's really important that we kind of reevaluate our relationship to the world around us, because it's having had this attitude for so long that's gotten us into so much trouble. It's not being able to really understand the landscapes around us or the earth systems that form our own well-being as well as that of animals. And so I try in the fiction, and Dead Astronauts is probably the most radical thing, to kind of make people see, to kind of like, shake them by the shirt collar, and say, see, please, just see this thing that is so invisible all the time. And I think also, that's applied as well in terms of how I've been talking about rewilding our yards on social media, which is to say that, through trail cams and everything else, I get to know individual animals. I get to know their individual behaviors. I get to know in a non-anthropomorphic way, what kind of a mother one raccoon is as opposed to another in the yard. They're very different. And I think that even just seeing these differences between individuals, regardless of how you evaluate intelligence, puts us in a position where it's harder to ignore, or it's harder to just make the rest of the world that's not human into a series of more or less inanimate objects that we can move around the board as much as we want.
Do you feel like, one of the challenges I feel like with respecting the natural world is, I think probably the best horror movie about that would be Grizzly Man, to some degree, is just that disconnect from,
right.
It's understanding animal psychology to an impressive degree, but however, still forgetting that the hard line that divides you from the other ant species and from your environment. And so I guess I'm curious to hear, is that, what do you think, I guess, is the way to be able to have that empathy towards the natural world without viewing it through, I guess the imperialist idea of human nature, or just human species being the dominant species in the world and everything is through our lens?
Well, I think it's just going also from the facts, and integrating the facts and science and biology with the observations about behavior is what I try to do to some degree on Twitter, for example. And also it's even driving, even though it's fiction, some of the characters in Dead Astronauts and others that are non-human, the fox has been, changed somewhat by humans to have slightly more human intelligence, which it resents, but it still has vestiges of fox-like intelligence, and that allows me to kind of get that across. And I guess that the point is integration as opposed to isolation. We're already integrated with the landscape, whether we like it or not, no matter how we try to kind of like separate ourselves off. And we just get into more and more trouble the less we can see that integration and how important it is to respect that. Even just, at this point, it comes down even to just like wise land management, which is a really boring way of putting it, but we can't even seem to do that anymore. And so when you see things like a lake in Florida suing for its rights, it may seem silly to some people at some point initially, but it's really about quality of life for everyone, human and non-human. It's saying that there are ecosystems and situations of landscape that should not be destroyed or ruined because that doesn't benefit humans or non-humans. And so, that's also with the native plants, something that's really struck home to me. I used to go hiking and I would just look for birds and mammals and things like that. That's what interested me. But now that I know all the plants, it's like suddenly the whole landscape is alive. And once you see all those connections and you understand what those connections mean and what happens when those connections are broken, then you become, I think a little more radicalized in terms of, we have to preserve biodiversity, in part because it helps preserve, it helps us with climate crisis, but also because we can't exist without it. And unfortunately, we have a certain amount of policymakers and people in general who thinks that because they think of themselves as separate from this, that they don't need it. In actual fact, we can't survive without it. We're not going to get to Mars and colonize Mars and somehow set up a new biosphere there. That's just not going to happen. We have this thing that we need to repair, and we need to understand it better, and we need to have better empathy towards it. And animals are often the ambassadors of that. That's who we identify with habitat, for example, are the animals in it, especially the charismatic ones.
Well, when I was reading through those novels, and the foxes play such a prevalent image roles throughout it, I was definitely brought to mind Japanese folklore with the fox, like their fox spirits, and that was that at all something that was on your mind when you were writing those?
I think the fox is well aware of kind of what I would call various cultural constraints that the fox. I had to really think carefully what the fox would think about this, and this particular fox. And so the fox, I think, makes a couple snide comments about what the fox is supposed to be according to different cultures, as opposed to what this individual fox is. And so that's a very different position than if I were writing from a human point of view and incorporating fox motifs and stuff, in which case that would kind of be integrated into the backdrop. But I think the fox actually does refer to the Japanese myth in a kind of dismissive way, along with all the other myths, which is just simply what this fox is going to do.
Going into, you were mentioning about sort of the confusion of what exactly are like the people in power doing in terms of like policy making and stuff like that. That's one of the things I also found interesting. In Bourne in particular, you see it, whereas what we have is the villains of the piece, the company, Mord, and the magician there's this, as it goes on, it becomes more and more clear, like there is no plot. but like there's no plan that they're following. It's all just sort of like there. It's the empty gestures of what their purposes are, and so I guess, do you find that to be something that's inescapable about policymaking as far as our interaction with the environment? Like, is that, can we
Well,
on a
yeah.
widespread level do that, or is it up to more of individuals being able to make real differences when it comes to that?
I think it's really important to know which things are effective on an individual level, like what kind of boycott actually helps with regard to individual choice, and then what is absolutely pointless on an individual level that has to be accomplished at a government or a corporation level. The point with the company, there are 2 points. Number one, the companies have all fused together to this point that they might as well, in some cases, just be called the company. But at a certain point, I didn't feel any obligation to give give any kind of anonymity to more specificity to the company name. But then also, the company does what a lot of companies do these days. It just produces as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe dysfunctional in that way, but it's only going to ever keep doing the same thing. And unfortunately, we see this in late stage capitalism right now, as you do see a lot of mindlessness with regard to corporations. You even see it now in this latest thing I saw, where you don't even necessarily have to return clothing anymore if it doesn't fit. They've figured out the cost benefit analysis of that is better that they just waste it than that they have you return it. So things like that really kind of just drive the point home. And then I would say also, I just wanted to point out that with regard to this kind of thing, this consumption, and also the idea with the company of it taking resources from one place to make luxury goods for another in a different mode. This is actually happening in Alabama right now, where you have European companies taking timber, cutting down forests in Alabama to make biomass fuel for factories in the European Union, supposedly because it's more green than burning coal. But in fact, they're doing it by laying waste to Alabama's forests. Similarly, another thing that's happening that's very extractive with developers is Alabama is one of the most biodiverse places in the world along, I don't know if it's the Mississippi River, or which river it is. And a lot of people don't know that that's going away real fast because of development. And so we get to a state where you can begin to see the outlines of the city and the company, even in places that, like Florida, like Alabama, that are incredibly biodiverse and rich and have maybe problems with regard to quality of life in terms of affordable housing and things like that. But in terms of natural resources, are extremely rich. So we're all kind of beginning to, unfortunately, get to the point where one day we'll wake up and we'll look out the window and we'll see the company and we'll see the ruined city. And so that's really the cautionary tale there. It's that it can happen anywhere.
Well, that's living in a time where there's so many sources of information out there, so many voices. I think that's one of the hardest things, is finding where you should listen to. Like, where is the person who actually is saying, hey, this is something that we actually should be talking about or looking at. So, not to put you on the spot, but do you have could you think of any resources off the top of your head that would be good for looking at, in terms of people who are curious about, where should their attention be directed as far as concerns with our ecology and resources?
Well, I mean, places like CNN have actually done reports on the kind of thing I'm talking about. So it's reached the national news. It's really hard to say, because for different kinds of things, there's different kind of reporting that makes sense. And so I tend to more cultivate, people on Twitter I trust to post things that are accurate, climate scientists and environmentalists. I've tried to do my own part by writing a long piece about Florida's environmental woes for Current Affairs in their latest issue and online. that I think also should resonate with people throughout the Southeast in terms of there's the same issues, I think, with regards to the environment in many cases, maybe minus the manatees, and also in Texas and also in Louisiana and places like that. So, I do think that the places that allow long-form journalism are really important, but then you need news outlets to kind of distill it down to the talking points, because not everyone's going to read a 10,000 word piece. But unfortunately, the issues are so complex. Those are the kinds of places we need to be going to for some of these kinds of issues, because they are complex, because they need to be kind of contemplated in their fullness. I'm sorry that's not a great answer to the question.
Oh no, it was a good answer. And just curious, do you get more catharsis writing about issues like that, straightforward, and just being like, this is what we need to be focused on, this is important, right, or sublimating it through your writing and art?
Well, I mean, they are very different things. And, I think back, and Dead Astronauts and Hummingbird Salamander both kind of came out of indirectly an environmental science class in upstate New York that I spoke to. And they said they liked Annihilation, but they would like fiction that was more direct. And so I think about that a lot in terms of like what form I use. First of all, you can't really be didactic in fiction, or you're defeating the purpose, but you can be more direct in certain ways. And oddly enough, Dead Astronauts, for all that it's not direct, is also very direct about the environment in some ways. But that does also mean that I've been turning more to nonfiction for that reason. And it's not so much what catharsis I get out of it; it's what is the best vehicle for the thing, and this kind of comprehensive, but also angry and rightfully angry piece, full of facts, full of like showing the systemic problems. That's very important. It's something that I was able to do because of Annihilation. Basically, they're not coming to me because I wrote some other book. It's because of Annihilation, and that gives me the platform to be able to pitch something like that. It eventually feeds back into the fiction. So all the stuff that I just learned, even though it turned me into kind of a policy wonk where I could go on some TV show and be a talking head, it'll eventually get subsumed back into the fiction. It'll come out in some unexpected way. Some fragment of it will come out in the mouth of some character talking about something else entirely. That's just the way it works.
I wanted to touch a little more on your writing itself, and you mentioned early on your works being formally experimental. And as I was reading some of your works, one of the things I like to do is I try to figure out what authors are reading, because I always find that fascinating. It's all a conversation, art. And so one of the things that I found myself struggling with was, and I'm not the biggest hard sci-fi genre reader. Not that I feel like your work is just that. But when I was reading your stuff, really the things that stuck more out to me was the attention to writing on a sentence level, voice, and that the way things are expressed, which really reminded me, if anything, more about some more of metafiction authors, such as Calvino came to mind, and the American author Gilbert Sorrentino. Not that those necessarily your influences, but I am just curious if you could speak about some of your influences as a writer.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's I had, it's just so many things. But and I said before, but formative in terms of like style, in terms of realizing what prose can really do in a novel or in a short story. Angela Carter was incredibly influential. Nabokov was incredibly influential. But then it also veered into writers like John Brunner and Stan on Zanzibar. And Dune, although I didn't remember too much from it in terms of my writing, I do remember there was a dinner scene early on where there's like, it goes back and forth between like 10 different points of view, and I found that pretty amazing. So sometimes you get something out of it other than what the point of the book was. Sometimes it's some technique. Stepan Chapman has a book called The Troika that, violates every rule of writing you can imagine, and yet is successful. And that was incredibly important to me in terms of being brave when I write, and understanding that you need to know the rules, but then you need to be able to break the rules if necessary. And then just tons and tons of writers. I mean, I've read so many writers. I mean, it's really difficult to even think of all of them. But the main thing about it is that they're all over the place. There's literary mainstream stuff. There's deeply weird space opera in there. There's just about everything you can imagine. The only thing that I generally don't like to read, even though I like to watch it, is westerns, and that's probably a flaw in me. But other than that, I'm pretty omnivorous. I went on a jag where I just read noir thrillers for like 3 years. So I just tend to be omnivorous. I take things from everywhere. I find that if I take things from everywhere, I can write more different things. Now, I might have similar themes a lot of the time, but the way that I choose to write is often very different, and that's only possible from assimilating, hopefully, a lot of technique from a lot of different places. And I also started out again as a poet. So I was submitting to literary magazines. I didn't really have a sense of writing weird fiction until editors started telling me that. I just assumed I'd be publishing mostly in literary magazines at that point, and maybe if I'd been publishing in Europe, I would have been. But yeah, so the category stuff has never really concerned me that much. I read a lot of graphic novels that I get a lot of influence out of, a lot of really interesting and sophisticated film technique I try to translate back into fiction. And every once in a while I'll drop something in there that's intentionally meant to be an allusion to something, But then there's also real life, like Annihilation, all the detail, that's all from hiking. There's not a single thing in there in terms of detail of the natural world that's actually from another book or anything. So.
I guess I know this is always a loaded question for writers, but
can't wait.
building on it, when you write, like, who would you say is your ideal reader?
Well, it changes from book to book, but mostly I try to think about leaving a space for the reader, and the kind of arrogant 20-something me was all about, art with no space for the reader, really. And I think about that more and more. I think about how I can just allude to something on the page and let the reader fill in the blank to some degree. And so I want a reader that I can trust, and I want a reader that's going to follow me wherever I go as much as possible. And I'm very thankful that I do have readers like that. Despite how many different kinds of books I write, they follow me. And mostly I just respect the reader. I want to write something that I would want to read, but I also do sometimes think about, is this the best entry point for the reader? Is there some better place to start for the reader to then really grapple with both the weirdness and the emotion of what comes next? So sometimes on my mind after a rough draft, is this really the best way to have written something or started out? And I do think of a reader, but I don't think of necessarily a very specific reader. Just hopefully someone. I think that I think of the reader as being smarter than me, and so I have to, and then I have to catch up. That's really what I try to think of it as.
Yeah, that reminds me of advice I once heard from a creative writing instructor was, whenever someone compliments something that you achieved with your writing, you always just say thank you, even if it's something you've never thought about yourself at all. If it was completely unintentional, if they see it, it's like, sure, that's exactly what it was.
Yeah, no, I mean, and sometimes there are interesting interpretations, especially of the Southern Reach, that aren't accurate as far as I'm concerned, but they're very interesting. I can see how they're plausible, and sometimes they're actually really inspirational on some other piece of fiction down the road too.
I know David Lynch said one of his favorite things was to read fan theories of his works, just because I guess he.
Oh yeah, I do. I actually read
making stories.
Yeah, no, I read all the academic papers too, because I usually learn something that's an underpinning for something later, or some text they refer to that I want to read about some subject related to the environment. So I read a lot of that stuff. I also have read some fan fiction. There's actually fan fiction of Annihilation combined with True Detective, with Rust going down into the tower tunnel with the biologist and them just having a conversation, and it just going the stairs keep going down and down and down, and they just keep having this conversation for like pages and pages and years and years. It's actually kind of interesting.
Is that a surreal experience reading fan fiction of your own work?
Not when it's something where I'm pretty much done with that part of it. You know, I don't read fan fiction if I'm in the middle of a series and I'm afraid it's gonna like mess with what I'm working on. But otherwise, it doesn't really bother me. The main thing is I don't like reach out to that creator and let them know I've read it.
Yeah.
I feel like they would get a little self-conscious, possibly, maybe not. But I don't want to like interrupt their process or their creativity in any way. But it's interesting to see.
Yeah, well, you're practicing your good citizenship to the environment, to the fan fiction writers.
Right.
Well, one other question I had, kind of touching on some of the things we've talked about, is what is the relation between technological advancement, let's call it, and what you write about in your fiction, since we are in a time where technology advances faster than it's ever has before?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, does it though? That's one question the writer has to ask. Does having a new smartphone really mean technology is advancing? I don't know. I think that it's really important to recognize that a lot of what we think of as technology is perhaps iterations and perhaps it's tools, but it doesn't necessarily mean something about our mindset. So I have to really think about, you know, is this technology that's changing the way that we think, or is this technology that's a reflection of some past idea? Are smartphones really something that, you know, is very smart? You know, so basically what a writer should do is kind of kick the wheels of the foundational assumption and really think about what is this technology that we're you know, that we're in the middle of. What does it mean that we have had self-driving cars for a while? They crash and blow up a lot, and we can't really seem to get to that final step where they actually are self-driving. You know, what's the difference between someone selling you something and someone who's doing technology? So there's a lot of different societal things to think about there that appeal to my sense of satire and absurdity. I generally tend to be suspicious just because it's always difficult to tell what some new piece of technology actually means. And I'm not really in the business of extrapolation. I'm really more in the business of the psychological truth of a situation. So I'm kind of more interested in, I'm less interested in the kind of what if story than I am in the, you know, what's happening to this person because of this, maybe on a very personal level.
Do you feel comfortable being identified with any particular genre at all, or does that feel limiting to you?
I just always thought I was going to be called a writer, and it's turned out that way sometimes, except for the 3 years that when I had written this thing as a journalist called the Steampunk Bible, and suddenly I was a steampunk writer, which is very awkward when people would buy a book, and it was not steampunk. So it was weird how you get labeled as things. And then, you know, being called a weird fiction writer, I feel more comfortable with, just in terms of it's not really a marketing category. It's not a category in the bookstore. When you have a conversation about it, you're having a conversation about something that's not marketing. And sometimes when you talk about science fiction or fantasy, you can wind up really talking about how something is marketed rather than what the thing is. So I like that term. I don't mind any particular term. You know, when I'm writing a certain thing, like Hummingbird Salamander has very little speculative elements. I wouldn't even call it a science fiction novel. I don't know that it makes sense to call me a science fiction writer in connection with it. So, you know, I also want that writer status as opposed to some label, because I'm going to be moving from one thing to the next, and maybe fantasy one time, maybe something very surreal, maybe something with very little speculative element at all. So I try to be a little slippery, just because it's important that the readers come to the books with the right expectations.
Do you ever find much pushback from publishers about that, or like Like, can you just give us another Annihilation, please?
Well, I'm very thankful that I'm with Farrar, Strauss and Giroux, because and their NCD imprint, because they've just basically followed me everywhere. But I will say that, if I was writing all like space operas or something, which is a genre that I love and respect and want to write in it someday, then calling me a science fiction writer and publishing me through science fiction would make sense. But when I write all over the place, what FSG does makes a lot of sense. They publish me into the mainstream, and then they also publish me into genre. But if I were being published through genre, but I was writing like a surreal book that might also appeal to someone who doesn't read any genre fiction, there'd be no way for them to find it. So I've done much better sales-wise since I've been marketed more towards a general reader, even though there are also going to be some of those general readers who are like, dead astronauts, what the bleep is this?
Well,
and rightly so. I mean, I don't blame them.
Well, I have a good friend who is, one of his, beloved memories is the moon landing launch and everything like that. So that was a very upsetting title when he sees that. Yeah. Still very romanticized astronauts, but I think that's what's powerful about it. It's like it's an upsetting. You don't want to see that because it's I think.
Well, at least it tells you what you're in for.
Yeah. One question I'd like to ask you about Born itself was, in thinking about it, well, Born and its two sibling works, was that I noticed that there's almost like doubles within the characters to some degree. You have Moss, who is a creator, and then Charlie X, who is also creator of sorts, and you have Rachel, the magician, Mord, that is once human, now not, Born, that is not human, but also feels a sense that it should behave in a way that is more human. The Strange Bird itself, the Dark Bird, were those kind of parallels intentional, or is that just the way that worked out?
I think it's well, I guess on one level it's not intentional. Until you said that, I didn't realize that was the case. On the other hand, there's such a thing as cause and effect. I mean, Moss is basically who she is because of Charlie X to some degree, and so there is a cause and effect there that kind of binds them in a twinning way. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't really think of it that way, but then there's things thematically and there's things in terms of resonance that do come from the subconscious, and I kind of just trust it when it comes out, and I don't necessarily always see what it is. And I think that's really kind of important, that you know what the mechanical things are you can practice, and you know the things that you just gotta basically go with your gut. And so that's probably where that comes from. It's a subconscious thing that has where there's a mirroring effect that kind of works for the novels.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for coming today. Again, my name is Anthony, and I am the leader here of Under the Mountain. You can find out more about Under the Mountain if you follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. You just would need to search at UNDRMTN. It's also in a YouTube channel. If you look at the page, it'll have all the information. Where can people find out more about you, Jeff, or see your writings and such?
All the Jeff VanderMeer addresses, online, Twitter, Facebook. The only place where it's a little different is it's Jeff VanderMeer _123 on Instagram, for reasons that I will leave mysterious. So.
All right. Well, and we'll also have that link too. So don't worry, you'll be able to find more of Jeff VanderMeer's stuff very easily. So thanks again, Jeff, for joining us today, and hope to hear back from you again.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.